So we left off in the last video with life and culture in Soviet society. So we'll pick up in this one with Stalinist terror and the Great Purges. So in the mid-1930s, they're in the midst of building this socialist state and a new society, and it culminated in ruthless police terror and a massive purging of the Communist Party. And this had been revived, terror as a state policy, that is, when they collectivized agriculture and in this drive against the peasants. And it got even worse in 1934. So Stalin's number 2 guy, Sergei Kirov, was mysteriously murdered in 1943. And Stalin blamed it on what he called fascist agents within the Communist Party itself. And he used that incident to purge the party of any supposed traitors or people who might betray him, and to solidify his own control. And so the state-sponsored repression was called the Great Purge of 1936 to 1938. And it was basically a series of public show trials where false evidence, often gathered using torture, was used to incriminate party administrators and Red Army leaders. So during this time, there were about 8 million people, including union officials, managers, intellectuals, army officers, those who had been faithful to the Communist Party, and countless ordinary citizens who were accused of counter-revolutionary activities and were arrested. Millions of those were executed, or the rest of them went to prison or a forced labor camp, never to return. And in place of those 8 million people, Stalin and the party leadership recruited 1.5 million new members to take the places of those who had been purged. And so the Great Purges brought substantial practical rewards to this new generation of committed communists. And this whole idea, the mass purge or the mass purges of Stalin, remain baffling. Some scholars have argued that terror is always a part of a fully developed totalitarian state. Part of being a totalitarian state is that you must always have a real or imagined enemy to fight against. And so there's been lots of debate over this, particularly with Stalin. Did he have a real threat? Were there people trying to come against him or his party? And some argue that Stalin's fears, even though they were exaggerated, they were real, and that some in the population were willing collaborators against Stalin, and that we'll probably never know for sure. So we're switching gears now to Mussolini and fascism in Italy, starting with the seizure of power. So even though Benito Mussolini began his political career as a revolutionary socialist, he eventually turned against the socialists and against the working class after World War I and turned instead toward the conservatives. And Mussolini and his supporters were first to use the term fascists. And again, these were revolutionaries who were trying to create a new totalitarian state in Italy based on extreme nationalism and extreme militarism. So in the early 20th century, the early 1900s, Italy was a liberal state with civil rights, a constitutional monarchy, King Victor Emmanuel, and it appeared to be moving toward democracy because they had granted universal male suffrage. However, the papacy, many devout Catholics, conservatives, and landowners remained opposed to these liberal institutions. And so relations between the church and the state were often very tense. And you have to keep in mind, we're talking about Italy. This is the home of Catholicism. So there's a very powerful church presence in Italy. On top of this, class differences were really extreme, and a powerful revolutionary socialist movement had developed that unanimously opposed the war from the very beginning. because of these sharp class divisions, the Socialist Party was thriving in Italy. And the war actually worsened the political situation. Workers and peasants had been promised social reform and land reform in exchange for their support for Italy during World War I. And they felt cheated when the war was over and the government did not deliver on their promises. So there was soaring post-war unemployment, terrible inflation. This created mass hardship, and it energized Italy's socialist movement. Radical workers and peasants began to occupy factories and seize land in 1920, and this scared the conservatives. It scared and mobilized the property-owning classes. So with the unrest and the fear, within that context stepped Mussolini, and Mussolini had been wounded in World War I. He returned home and almost immediately began organizing bitter war veterans like himself into a band of fascists. And at first, this was a radical combination of nationalist and socialist demands, including territorial expansion, benefits for workers, and land reform for peasants. But Mussolini very quickly realized that when he verbally assaulted rival socialists, then conservatives liked him. So he actually shifted gears in 1920. He even became a sworn enemy of socialism. So Mussolini and his private militia called the Black Shirts grew increasingly violent. They destroyed socialist newspapers, union halls, local Socialist Party headquarters, and worked tirelessly to push the socialists out of city governments in northern Italy. And before long, fascism became a mass movement. And so when the government collapsed in 1922, largely because of the chaos created by Mussolini and his black shirt militias, Mussolini stepped right in as the savior and the guy who would bring order and prosperity back to Italy. And so in October of 1922, a group of armed fascists marched on Rome and threatened the king, Victor Emmanuel III, forcing him to appoint Mussolini Prime Minister of Italy. The regime in action. So initially, Mussolini moved cautiously to establish control, and he promised a return to order. And while he was doing that, he was working in the background to consolidate his support among Italian elites. And so in April of 1924, there was an election, and this happened right after an electoral law was passed that allowed the Fascist Party and its allies to win an overwhelming majority. So April 1924, Mussolini then charged forward, declaring his desire to make the nation fascist. And he proceeded to impose a series of repressive measures. For instance, the freedom of the press was abolished, elections were fixed, the government ruled by decree as Mussolini had his political opponents arrested. They disbanded all independent labor unions and put dedicated fascists in control of Italian schools. Mussolini did manage to gain support from broad sectors of the population. He compromised with traditional elites that had controlled the army. He left big business to regulate itself, and he chose not to enact land reform. And that made some people happy and, in essence, made them okay with Mussolini and his fascist party. Another political move that Mussolini made was to sign the Lateran Agreement. And this was signed in 1929 by Mussolini and the Pope. And the agreement simply stated that Mussolini would recognize the Vatican as an independent state, and in return, the Pope would support Mussolini's government. And Mussolini made this look really good. He staged massive rallies and sporting events and created fascist youth and women's movements and provided new welfare benefits. His government did oppose, actually vehemently oppose, liberal feminism, though. Mussolini promoted traditional gender roles, and all of this was matched with military action. His aggressive speeches, his rhetoric was matched with the military. Italian armies invaded Ethiopia in 1935, of course defeating the poorly equipped Ethiopian army in a brutal colonial war that pretty much shocked everyone except for Hitler. So it shocked the international community, but pretty much cemented his tie with Nazi Germany. So Mussolini, in one way, was deeply influenced by Hitler's example. The Mussolini government passed a series of anti-Jewish racial laws in 1938. With all of this, Mussolini's fascist Italy, it was repressive, it was undemocratic, but it was never really totalitarian. The two main reasons for this is, one, the existence of the church. Many Italians still considered the Vatican, the Catholic Church, to be a higher authority than any government. God was at the top of this hierarchy. So a lot of people considered the church to be a higher organization than Mussolini's government. And the other major factor that made Mussolini's fascism not totally totalitarian was that the factories were not owned by the government. They were still owned by rich industrialists. So we will go ahead and bring this to an end, and we'll pick up in the next video with Hitler and Nazism in Germany.